This video is part 1 of Chapter 13 for PSY 222, Research Methods in the Psychological Sciences. In this chapter, we're going to go over briefly the important role that communication plays in psychological science and in science in general. And like all methods of communication, things are made easier if there are agreed upon norms, expectations, and rules. And those are communicated to us largely through the publication manual of the American Psychological Association, which is newly out in the 7th edition. I, like all of my colleagues, am adjusting to some of the changes that have been made since the 6th edition. And you, as students of psychology, will be learning, probably for the first time paying serious attention to it, you'll be learning the basics of APA style and the expectations we have of each other as scientists communicating through scientific journals, presentations at conferences, and so on. So we start with just giving you the why part of this equation. When we conduct research, we want to be able to communicate with others who are interested in our same domain of research, our same area of interest, but we also want to communicate with the wider community who may be interested in the work that we're doing. If we're going to argue that the research we are doing matters, then it should matter just as much to get those findings out to people. And as I said, there need to be agreed upon rules for how to do that. When we communicate findings, whether it's at a conference or in a journal, or even in some of the newer ways in which researchers are getting their work out, which is through their own private blog sites or the like, we benefit from having structure, and that includes everything from the punctuation expectations to having peer review, having editors and reviewers go over our work and evaluate it in terms of its quality and the value of putting it out into the public forum for consumption. When reviewers, whether they're looking at conference presentations and papers and posters, or they're looking at a manuscript for publication in a journal, that peer review process assesses both the quality of the research and the effectiveness of the communication and the presentation that you're giving. And that's why we take such great pains to introduce you as a beginning student in psychological sciences. We introduce you to the norms of the writing process, teaching you how to put together a manuscript, how to talk about your methods, how to talk about your statistics and your findings, how to cite sources and build an argument in a way that's consistent with the community of scholars that are psychologists. So the rules, basically, the norms and expectations that we follow in psychology are dictated to us through the American Psychological Association. As I mentioned just a bit ago, there's a new edition. The 7th edition came out earlier in 2020. The APA provides, if I always tell my advisees, if you're planning on going to graduate school in psychology or a related field, you should probably just go ahead and buy an APA manual because you will need it during your graduate studies as a reference and to help you prepare manuscripts that you'll be expected to write. Even if you don't invest in the manual itself, the APA provides a wide range of documentation. I know some of you are familiar with going to the Purdue OWL site. They are still in the process of updating their materials for APA style to the 7th edition, so there are some spotty errors. If you are accustomed to using a variety of reference generators and citation generators that are available on the web, be very careful. They may or may not be up to date in terms of the APA 7 guidelines for references and citations and a variety of other tools that you may use. This is particularly the case if you are using the reference tool through Microsoft Word or popular reference generators that are available online. Even the best ones, even the ones that are updated frequently for style changes, make errors, like errors of capitalization, errors of italicization, that you have to be very careful about. There are also emerging standards and changing standards for how to cite online sources. So it's helpful to kind of grab this web address, maybe bookmark it for other psychology classes that you take. I should also say that the APA resources that I posted for you on D2L, there's a whole folder in the course resources for that. All of the handouts that I provided for you, I found at this website. So you might want to bookmark that for future reference. Now your authors, Shaughnessy et al., they give you just some basic guidelines for being a good writer. These are not writing guidelines that are unique to psychological science or to scientific writing. It's just good writing. These guidelines, you should just review them. They're probably familiar to you from a writing course that you've taken either in college or in high school. It's helpful if you know who your audience is. If you are writing for a community of scholars, you're writing knowing that your audience probably has a basic background in psychological science, in methodology, and if you're writing for a specific journal, for example, you can make some assumptions about the common language of that particular research area. When I instruct students, I tell them, you are writing not just for me, you are also writing for your fellow students, and to aim your writing at that audience. Once you're a graduate student, or if you become a professional psychologist and you want to do a conference presentation or you want to publish in a journal, your audience is the people who go to the conference. Your audience is the people who are reading in that journal. The second guideline is to identify the purpose of your writing. And the recommendation is that you use an expository style. And your goal ultimately is to describe what you've done in your research and to be persuasive. So you're building arguments and presenting those arguments, and you want to be persuasive to your audience. Now, you're not writing fiction here, you're not writing literature, so there are, conventions in scientific writing that in some ways make it a bit dull. To be honest, it can be pretty formulaic at times, and sometimes students get really frustrated with me when I provide them with editing advice that has kind of toned down their rhetoric to make it less entertaining, shall we say. There's, in most journals, scientific journals, as well as conference papers and presentations, there's a general kind of frowning upon of using stylistic writing that is more comfortable in literary circles than in scientific ones. And that kind of leads us to the third suggestion, which is to focus on clarity. Good expository writing is clear in terms of your thinking and your expressions. If you see on a paper, one of your worksheets or your draft of your research report, if I put off a comment off to the side that says unclear, what it means is that I don't know what you're trying to say, and you need to clarify your language. what we try to do in terms of what we write is to be clear, logical, and straightforward in our language. Now, for some students, again, they find that very frustrating. I've had many, brilliant writers as students who are really gifted in creative writing, where there's more tolerance for unconventional sentence structure, unconventional wording. APA style is very conventional. You have to use good grammar, very clear sentence structure, and a very clear logical flow of ideas. There's also a tendency in scientific writing, you don't want to waste people's time. Often when I'm giving feedback to students on their scientific writing, I try to take out words that just aren't necessary or that are repetitive. And again, sometimes students get frustrated with me and have even said to me, Dr. Daly, I was just trying to be creative. And I suggest to them, student, your job is not creativity here, it's clarity and being concise. So you say only what needs to be said. Use shorter words, shorter sentences, because they are easier to understand and they don't interfere with meaning. Now, that doesn't mean that you cut corners and you don't use all of the information that's required, but you say only what needs to be said. As you do revisions, you can decrease your wordiness. I tend to be a very wordy writer by instinct, and what I've learned from my mentors is how to go back through a draft and take out every unnecessary word, every repetition, so that my writing becomes more concise and more clear. The fifth guideline is about precision, making sure that because you're communicating to scientists, you want to be crystal clear about what you've done. So you have to use the lingo, the words, the vocabulary that is common to your audience. And this is especially the case if you're using words that are connected to a theory, or words that describe devices or constructs that are part of the shared knowledge base of psychology. Some words are defined differently in popular culture than they are in the world of psychology research. You have to be careful about those words, because if you use them, they may be misinterpreted or misunderstood. And then finally, you do have to follow good grammatical rules. I have often been accused by my students of having an unhealthy obsession with grammar. I'm not perfect at grammar. I'm especially not perfect about commas. I tend to be a little comma happy, so I try to control my comma behavior. But I do try very hard to give students good advice about their grammar and usage. I am very strict on spelling. It helps that we have word processors now, like Microsoft Word, that underline for us every misspelled word. If you see those red squiggly underlines, you should fix them. I hopefully don't need to say that a second time. Now, Word does make grammar suggestions as well, but Word is a computer, not a human. It's not always right, but it's worth, when there's a blue squiggly line under parts of your sentences, take a look and see if it improves the precision and clarity to take their suggestion. Now, this set of guidelines are ones that really do go beyond kind of just the basic rules for good writing. We do have, and APA style communicates this, we do have this guideline that suggests that we need to, in the language that we use, avoid bias. So what number 7 here says, write fairly. There's a whole chapter in the APA manual on reducing bias in language. So in all of our journals that are sponsored by the APA, there's a set of expectations about the type of language you're expected to use. And some of these expectations have changed over the decades since I was first a student. So we're supposed to use bias-free language when we're referring to some of the obvious big categories, such as sex differences, race, ethnic group differences, age differences, differences based on disability status, and so on. The tendency is to recommend that we use what's called person-first language, where, for instance, instead of calling a group of people with schizophrenia schizophrenics, you say they are people diagnosed with schizophrenia. Instead of saying old people, you get specific and label the boundaries of the group based on the actual age that you're interested in, say 65 to 85, something like that. We've also moved, and this is a change from the 1980s when I was a student in the class that you're taking. We all called everybody, whether they were humans or rats, subjects. Human participants in research are now called participants. It was seen as dehumanizing to refer to human beings as subjects, so we are now expected to use the word participants. There still are some journals that use the blanket term subjects, regardless of whether they're talking about people or non-human species. But the APA standard right now is if you're talking about human beings, you talk about participants. If you're talking about non-human species as a part of your research, they are typically referred to as subjects. The eighth guideline is I know that I've said that research writing tends to be straightforward and clear. That doesn't mean it can't be interesting. You are trying to share with an audience of interested scholars your work and why it's important. You can do that in an interesting and compelling way without being literary, without using some of the tools and techniques of creative writing. So you can be clear and precise and very specific without those sorts of embellishments. So you should try and write an interesting report, present your ideas directly, but do so in a compelling manner. And that's really gets down to being persuasive about your argument. You can argue with some passion about why your research is important and why your findings are interesting. The final guideline here is one of the best ways to learn how to be a good writer in your chosen area of study is to read articles. Often students tell me when they start reading scientific journal articles in psychology, it's like they're studying a foreign language. And in a way, that's true. You're being introduced to new vocabulary, words that you're unfamiliar with, and not just when you get into the results section and you dig into the weeds of the statistics that you're being presented with. You're being introduced to all kinds of new concepts and constructs, new vocabulary, new lingo that is kind of part of the shared language of people doing research in a particular area. But over time, the more you read and the more you absorb, the better you will understand both what you're reading, and it will prepare you to write better. You'll start to pattern yourself after the structure of the sentences that you're reading. You'll start to learn those vocabulary words and how to use them effectively. So I've always found that the more I read, the more I consume, the better a writer I become. Because I acquire more words, I get smarter about how to put them together, and so on. I would add another guideline to those presented here, respond to the feedback of your teacher or your editor. When people get feedback, and I am kind of notorious, sometimes students respond to the feedback I give them with horror, some with anger and upset. I would like to encourage you to let go of those negative feelings. The only way you are going to learn how to be an effective scientific writer is with guidance. You are a novice. I am giving you training to think about ideas with clarity and precision. I give suggestions about wording to help you word things differently. That's why for every worksheet I've provided you with a model in my own words for how to do things, not because they're the right way. I'm sure that any of my colleagues in the department, if they read the sample research report that I just posted yesterday on D2L, that they would find much to complain about in my writing. It's a first shot. It's put together the way I think a student could put together a report. I'm sure that if you read it, you'll find some errors and some mistakes. So when I read your writing, I am not judging you. I'm not thinking bad thoughts about you. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I'm trying to give you guidance and suggestions about how to improve your writing and your writing style. So how do we structure these things called research reports? And that's what you're getting practice with here this semester. Every worksheet that you've done for the semester project is designed to give you the practice that you will need before you get to the senior research series 400 and 405 to build an APA style research report. The APA manual specifies a very rigid structure for how to build a research report. The new manual does a nice thing. They have a couple of examples of different kinds of recommended structure for papers. They have guidance for a manuscript for a professional paper, and that's the type of manuscript that we're asking you to write in a research report, is to put it in the style of a research report presented presented in a professional context. They also provide an example of what's called a student paper, and that would be your more traditional paper where it's topical. Let's say you're in developmental psychology and your teacher says, choose from this list of topics, find 6 references, and write a paper about it. That kind of a literature review paper is very common in undergraduate coursework. So there's a different formatting structure for that type of paper. So what we're going to talk about here and what you're going to be putting together here next week for your research report it follows this format that Shaughnessy is describing. Now, one thing before we go any farther about your Shaughnessy text, it was published before the APA 7 came out. So there are some slight stylistic changes and differences that are not necessarily updated. So you should always, if you see something that confuses you, like how something is cited or how a reference is built, or recommendations for the formatting of a page, you should always go to the handouts that I have given you on D2L as guidelines. So this is the basic structure of a research report. You have your first page is the title page, followed by the abstract page, and it is on its own page, followed by the text of your research report, which includes 4 sections, not necessarily within those 4 sections there are subsections sometimes, but that depends on exactly what kind of paper you're presenting. So within the text you have an introduction, method, results, and discussion, Now those should sound familiar. I had a worksheet for every one of those. So you've done an abstract worksheet, an introduction worksheet, a method worksheet, a results worksheet, and a discussion worksheet. On worksheet 1, you also worked on references. The reference page comes after the discussion. If you use footnotes, and we typically do not expect them in student writing, so you will not have footnotes for your research report. After the references, you have any tables or figures. Notice that the tables and figures are not embedded in the actual text of the paper. Every table and figure gets its own page, its own separate page, and they follow the references. If you have any appendices, and you will not have appendices for your research report for this class, they go at the very end. Now we're going to start with the title page. You did not have a worksheet for this. I've captured some images from the APA manual, the 7th edition, because there are some changes. One of the first changes, we used to have to type the words running head and then a colon and follow it with what's called a short title. APA 7 has done away with the words running head. We just have the same short title. It's always in all caps. We always have the page number. The page number starts on the title page, is always up at the right, in the right-hand corner of the page. I have provided you with a Microsoft Word template with a space for the running head already built into the header function and the page number already built in to the formatting. So you should download that template and save your own copy and use it as the structure for your paper. Titles are centered. They're in bold now. And titles in an APA paper, they communicate. They're typically not cute. They're mostly not even interesting. They communicate the variables that you're studying and the nature of their proposed relationship. So, they do tend to provide more information than you might expect, and they can be kind of long. So you provide the title of the research project, the author's names. You have first name, initial, last name. If there are multiple authors, they're separated by commas, and the word and then you have the organization that the person represents. And if you have multiple authors from different institutions, that's what all these little numbers are for, is to indicate which organization or institution goes with which author. Now in your research report, there's just you, and there's just the University of Mount Union, so the little numbers are not necessary. Now, you will also not be required to do an author note. What is done for journals is you provide your contact information, who to give correspondence to, any kind of conflict of interest, and other instructions that might be useful to the reader or to the editor of the journal. But again, you aren't going to be required to do an author note in your paper. The next page is the abstract, and I believe I mentioned at some point, I don't know, it's been a long semester, abstract, oh, I know where, Shaughnessy says it in the text, write it last, always write the abstract last. Oh, it's right there. See, it has been a really long semester. Basically, an abstract is a one-paragraph summary of the whole project. They are typically less than 250 words. They start with the word abstract in bold, and that's centered. That's a change. It didn't used to be in bold. Notice that the paragraph is not indented. The paragraph is double-spaced. At the bottom, you indent 5 spaces. You have the italicized word keywords. Keywords are search terms, basically. They should be the concept names that represent your variables. so that if your work got published, for example, someone else who, let's say they're interested in college teaching, they plug that into PsycInfo. If you've entered it as a keyword, it's going to be indexed using those keywords so that someone else would find your work if you use those keywords. Now, you've seen the abstract worksheet, so I don't need to review the main elements. I've asked you, by having you do that worksheet, I'm asking you to write sentences that represent each of those major elements within the abstract. The introduction, and again, you've done the introduction worksheet. Introduction sections have have a number of different objectives. First, you're introducing the problem, and if you go back to your intro section worksheet, I have you do these formulaic sentences, introducing the area of interest, narrowing it down, and then presenting your research question, then kind of plugging in your summaries of the research articles that you read, and trying to build an argument that then leads up to your hypotheses. So your goal when you're putting together your introduction section is to first articulate what you're studying and why it's important. Then you're summarizing the relevant background literature that gives your reader a sense of what's been studied related to your question in the past. And then you're going to finish with a statement that really kind of reinforces the purpose and rationale of the study and presents your hypotheses as they connect to this research literature that you've described. Now I'm going to pause there. That'll be the end of part 1 of chapter 13. We'll come back with the remainder of the summary of the research report.